Behind every great fortune lies a great crime, or so the old saying goes. We are about to pull back the velvet curtain on the world of old money, where sprawling estates and impeccable manners hide secrets so dark they could shatter entire family legacies. By the end of this journey, you will understand the true human cost of dynastic wealth and the lies required to maintain it. We will uncover why a Vanderbilt heiress lived in isolated misery and what shocking truth the Rockefeller fortune was built upon. These are not just stories of lavish parties and art collections, but of gilded cages, tragic destinies, and scandals so profound they were buried for generations. What do you believe is the ultimate price of a perfect public image? Cornelius Vanderbilt built an empire with nothing but ferocious will and a single ferry boat. He was known as the Commodore, a man whose railroad and shipping ventures forged one of the greatest fortunes the world had ever seen. His was the raw, explosive energy of new money, conquered through cutthroat business deals and sheer force of personality. But the generation that followed him did not inherit his drive to build. They inherited only the immense weight of his wealth and a desperate need to spend it. This was the true beginning of the Vanderbilt curse, a shift from creating fortunes to performing an endless, expensive pantomime of aristocracy. The family's spending became a spectacle in itself. They erected monumental palaces along New York's Fifth Avenue, with one branch of the family building 10 mansions in a row, a street of marble and limestone known as Vanderbilt Row. They constructed summer cottages in Newport, Rhode Island, that were larger than the homes of European royalty, with 70-room shadows like the breakers serving as mere seasonal retreats. They launched private yachts that were essentially floating palaces, each one more opulent than the last. This was not mere luxury. It was a frantic, public competition for social status, a race to prove they belonged at the very top of American society. And it came with a devastating hidden cost. The fortune that had taken one lifetime of ruthless work to build was being systematically dismantled across just 2 or 3 generations, drained by an ocean of guilt, marble, and social ambition. The most poignant victim of this gilded cage was Gladys Vanderbilt. She was born into unimaginable privilege, the daughter of one of the richest men in America. Her inheritance was a figure so vast it is difficult to comprehend even today. Yet, for Gladys, this fortune was not a key to freedom, but the lock on a beautifully decorated prison. Her life was a whirlwind of arranged introductions, glittering parties, and the constant, suffocating pressure to marry according to her station. She was the ultimate prize in a high-stakes game of social climbing, her personal desires utterly secondary to the demands of the Vanderbilt name. The very wealth that was meant to secure her future instead isolated her from any chance of a normal, authentic connection. She lived surrounded by servants and sycophants, but profoundly alone, her vast inheritance completely useless in purchasing the one thing she truly craved: simple happiness. Her story is a haunting lesson in the poverty of extreme wealth. It forces us to ask, what is the real value of a fortune if it only buys you a lifetime of loneliness? The Vanderbilts' darkest secret was not a single scandalous event, but this slow, generational erosion of purpose and joy, a curse of gold that left their heirs rich in everything but the things that truly matter. While the Vanderbilts were building palaces, another family was perfecting the art of ruling from a drawing room. If the Vanderbilt curse was a slow erosion of purpose, the Astor family's secret was a carefully constructed lie, one that began to crack under the weight of its own perfection. At the very center of this gilded world stood the original Mrs. Astor, Caroline Schermerhorn Astor. She was not merely a wealthy socialite. She was a supreme commander in the endless war for status. Her weapon was a small, leather-bound book known as the famous 400 list. This was not a simple guest list. It was a social registry that determined who mattered in New York and who did not. To be included meant you had old money, impeccable lineage, and the approval of Mrs. Astor herself. To be excluded was a form of social death. Her famous ballroom held exactly 400 people because, as she famously declared, that was all the room could hold. In truth, it was all the people she deemed worthy of existing in her world. This was not just entertainment. It was a brutal, calculated exercise in power, designed to maintain a flawless public image at any cost. But behind the glittering facade of her opera boxes and ballrooms, a very different reality festered within her own home. Her husband, William Backhouse Astor Jr., was the hidden scandal. While Caroline meticulously managed her social empire, William pursued a life of pure, unapologetic debauchery. He maintained a separate, parallel existence filled with heavy drinking and a series of very public mistresses. He was a regular and notorious figure in the gambling halls and less respectable corners of the city, a world his wife worked tirelessly to pretend did not exist. Their marriage became a well-known charisma, a silent agreement to live entirely separate lives under the same massive roof. The Astor name was synonymous with dignity and propriety, yet the man who carried that name was actively undermining it every single day. This was the family's first and most dangerous secret, the profound hypocrisy that threatened to shatter their pristine image if it ever became the main topic of conversation in those very ballrooms Caroline so tightly controlled. The rot, however, did not stop with one generation. The immense pressure to maintain this perfect facade seeped into the very bloodline, corrupting it from within. After the deaths of the first Mrs. Astor and her husband, their children and grandchildren became locked in bitter public battles over the colossal inheritance. These were not simple disagreements, but vicious legal wars that dragged the family's private grievances into the harsh light of the courtroom. Fortunes were squandered on legal fees, and private hatreds were printed on the front pages of every newspaper for the masses to devour. Even more telling was the shocking mental instability that began to surface. One of the most prominent heirs, William Vincent Astor, became known for his increasingly paranoid and reclusive behavior. He suffered from severe, debilitating neuroses, a deep-seated fear of germs, and a terror of being poisoned that isolated him completely. The man who inherited one of America's greatest fortunes was, in the end, a prisoner of his own mind. This was the ultimate price of the Astor legacy. The relentless drive for social perfection, the hidden lives of scandal, and the crushing weight of all that money did not create a dynasty of happy, fulfilled individuals. It created a lineage fractured by greed and haunted by a darkness that no amount of gilding could ever conceal. But no myth of old money control has proven more persistent or more dangerous than the ones surrounding the Rothschild family. Their actual story begins not in shadowy backrooms, but with the ambition of Mayor Amschel Rothschild in the cramped Jewish quarter of Frankfurt in the 1700s. He was a financier of remarkable foresight, who laid the foundation for a banking empire by strategically placing his 5 sons in 5 key European cities: London, Paris, Frankfurt, Vienna, and Naples. This was not a conspiracy, but a brilliant logistical network, allowing them to move capital and information across a continent, often at war with itself. Their success was built on trust, efficiency, and an unparalleled courier system that gave them a legitimate, if formidable, advantage. Yet this very success, this visible web of financial influence, became the fertile ground for a far darker and entirely fictional narrative to take root. The family's wealth and their Jewish faith made them a perfect, terrifying canvas onto which people could project their deepest fears about unseen power. The most enduring myth, one that still circulates today, claims the family secretly controls all the world's money. This story is a complete fabrication, a piece of anti-Semitic propaganda that twists their legitimate financial acumen into a tale of malevolent global domination. For generations, the Rothschilds have had to live under the weight of this lie, forced to publicly deny a fiction that refuses to die. The human cost of this perpetual suspicion has been immense. Family members grew up knowing they were viewed not as individuals, but as characters in a sinister plot. They lived with the constant low hum of threat, the awareness that their name could inspire not just respect, but also baseless hatred and fear. This shadow followed them even in their most generous moments. The family has been one of history's most prolific philanthropists, funding hospitals, universities, museums, and scientific research for centuries. They donated vast tracts of land to the public, including some of the most beautiful parks in Israel. But in the twisted logic of conspiracy, these acts of public good are often reinterpreted as evidence of a deeper, more manipulative scheme. How exhausting it must be to have every gesture of goodwill scrutinized for a hidden, evil motive. The Rothschilds' darkest secret is not one they created, but one that was forced upon them, a phantom of absolute power that has haunted their every step and proven that the most dangerous inheritance is not always money, but a poisoned reputation. While the Rothschilds were haunted by a phantom reputation, the Guggenheim family actively built a new one from the ground up. Their name is now synonymous with modern art, immortalized by the iconic Spiral Museum in New York City. But that gleaming white edifice sits atop a foundation of smelted ore and human struggle. The family's immense wealth did not begin with a vision for culture, but with the brutal, gritty reality of mining. Mayor Guggenheim, the patriarch, started with humble beginnings, importing Swiss embroidery. His true fortune, however, was unlocked in the silver and copper mines of the American West. These were not clean, orderly operations. They were dangerous, dust-choked pits where men worked for pennies in conditions that bordered on servitude. The profits that poured from those mines were staggering, but they were extracted at a tremendous human cost, a reality carefully airbrushed from the family's public story. This was the original sin of the Guggenheim fortune, the dark, metallic core beneath the layers of beautiful paint. The most famous heir to this complicated legacy was Peggy Guggenheim. She became a celebrated patron of the avant-garde, a woman who used her inheritance to rescue artists and masterpieces from the shadow of war. Her Venetian palazzo is a shrine to modernism, and her public persona was one of bohemian freedom and impeccable taste. Yet her personal life was a stark contrast to the serene beauty she collected. She was plagued by a deep, abiding loneliness and a series of tumultuous, often painful relationships. Her own family was fractured by resentment and distance. While she presented an image of a liberated heiress, she was, in many ways, as isolated as Gladys Vanderbilt, trapped in a gilded cage of her own making, surrounded by magnificent art, but estranged from the simple comforts of a stable family life. The money that empowered her to shape the art world also seemed to curse her chances at personal happiness. This theme of internal family conflict was not unique to Peggy. The Guggenheim dynasty, like the Astors before them, was repeatedly torn apart by vicious legal battles over their vast inheritance. The same fortune that built museums also fueled decades of bitter lawsuits between siblings and cousins. These were not quiet disagreements, but public, acrimonious fights that laid bare the jealousies and greed festering beneath the surface of a supposedly united clan. The pursuit of cultural immortality, it seemed, did not erase the baser instincts sparked by immense wealth. In fact, many critics have argued that the family's immense philanthropic efforts, their funding of museums and galleries, served a dual purpose. While genuinely advancing culture, it also acted as a powerful tool of reputation laundering. By associating their names so permanently with beauty and enlightenment, they could distance themselves from the grim origins of their wealth. The gleaming Guggenheim Museum becomes a monument that asks you to look at the art on its walls, not the difficult history buried in its foundation. What does it truly cost a family to trade a controversial past for a curated legacy? And is any amount of beautiful art worth the price of forgotten suffering? The gleaming white halls of the Guggenheim Museum present a stark contrast to the soot-stained origins of the fortune that built it. A reminder that every great philanthropic legacy has a beginning, and those beginnings are rarely clean. This brings us to the most complex and carefully constructed myth of them all, the story of John D. Rockefeller and Standard Oil. His name is now practically synonymous with charitable giving, a towering figure of American philanthropy. But the foundation of that giving was an empire built with a ruthlessness that redefined the very nature of corporate power. Rockefeller did not simply compete in the oil business. He sought to become the oil business. His vehicle for this was the Standard Oil Company, and his methods were as systematic as they were brutal. He perfected a tactic known as predatory pricing. In regions where independent refiners tried to operate, Standard Oil would deliberately slash its prices to levels so low that no smaller company could possibly match them. They could afford to take massive, temporary losses in one town to bankrupt a rival, knowing their dominance in other markets would fund the fight. Once the competition was wiped out, Standard Oil would jack the prices back up, often even higher than before. This was not fair competition. It was economic warfare waged against small business owners, and it left a trail of financial ruin in its wake. The arsenal did not end there. Rockefeller and his associates were accused of industrial espionage, of bribing railroad officials for secret rebates that gave them an unbeatable advantage, and of orchestrating sophisticated corporate espionage networks to learn their rivals' every move. The goal was absolute control, a complete monopoly over the refining, transportation, and sale of petroleum in America. By the late 1880s, Standard Oil controlled nearly 90% of the country's oil refining. This was not a market, it was a privately owned utility, and its master was John D. Rockefeller. This unchecked power could not last forever. The public and the government finally pushed back, leading to a landmark antitrust case that culminated in 1911, with the Supreme Court ordering the breakup of Standard Oil into 34 smaller, independent companies. It was a monumental ruling, a declaration that no single corporation should hold that much power over the economic life of the nation. The monopoly was broken, but the fortune remained, and with it, the need to salvage a legacy. This is where the Rockefeller story takes its most fascinating turn. The man who had been publicly vilified as a ruthless monopolist embarked on one of history's most ambitious campaigns of reputation management. He began a strategic, highly publicized effort of philanthropic giving on a scale never before seen. He funded universities, medical research institutes, and foundations dedicated to public health and education. Every dollar given was a brick in a new public image, transforming the robber baron into the benevolent patriarch. He was famously photographed handing out dimes to children, a carefully staged gesture of humility designed to soften his terrifying public persona. Yet, in his private life, a different struggle was unfolding. For all his wealth and power, Rockefeller was a man haunted by his own mortality and morality. He suffered from chronic health issues, including a severe case of alopecia that caused him to lose all the hair on his body, a physical transformation that must have felt like a profound and very visible vulnerability. He was a devout Baptist who wrestled privately with the contradiction between his cutthroat business practices and his Christian faith. How does a man reconcile a lifetime of crushing competitors with the biblical injunction to love thy neighbor? This internal conflict became the true, hidden cost of his success. The public relations could clean up his image, but it could not cleanse his conscience. The Rockefeller legacy, therefore, presents us with an almost unsolvable riddle. Can vast, world-changing philanthropy ever truly wash away the human cost of the fortune that funds it? Does building a hospital with one hand absolve the damage done by the other? The darkest secret here is not just the ruthless tactics, but the profound moral bargain at the heart of it all. A bargain that forces us to question whether any amount of good given later can ever justify the means of its acquisition. The Rockefellers' moral reckoning pales next to the literal explosions that forged another American dynasty. The DuPont family name became synonymous with power, but it was a power literally forged in fire and gunpowder. Their fortune, which would eventually stretch into chemicals and plastics, began with a single volatile product, blasting powder for rifles and cannons. The early DuPont mills were not clean, safe factories. They were death traps perched on the banks of streams, ready to power the grinding mills, and equally ready to dilute the blood that would inevitably spill. Explosions were not a matter of if, but when. In the first decade alone, multiple workers lost their lives in catastrophic accidents, their deaths often dismissed as the unavoidable cost of doing business. The company's own records, when they were kept at all, downplayed the tragedies, referring to them as incidents or misfortunes rather than acknowledging the systemic lack of safety. The family built an empire on controlled destruction, yet they could never fully control the destruction happening within their own walls. This dangerous legacy of putting production above people became the family's first and most violent secret, buried not in documents, but in the very soil of their original works. The internal family dynamics, however, proved even more explosive than their product. The 20th century brought a feud so vicious, it nearly shattered the company from within. It pitted Alfred I. DuPont against his own cousins, Pierre and Coleman. The conflict was not a simple disagreement. It was a brutal war for the soul of the DuPont company. Alfred accused his cousins of mismanagement and of systematically freezing him out of power. The ensuing legal battle dragged the family's dirtiest laundry into public view, revealing a nest of resentment, jealousy, and naked ambition. It was a classic story of old money dysfunction, where the shared goal of preserving wealth was devoured by personal animosity. The case exposed a simple, ugly truth: that the bonds of blood were far weaker than the allure of control. This was not the polished image of a unified industrial aristocracy they presented to the world. It was a raw, human struggle for power, proving that no amount of gilding can protect a family from its own internal demons. And those demons took other, more private forms. Behind the grand estates and corporate boardrooms lay a troubling history of mental illness and extreme reclusive behavior. Alfred himself, for all his fighting spirit, was a deeply isolated figure, plagued by paranoia and depression in his later years. Other family members retreated from public life entirely, becoming ghost-like figures in their own mansions, their existence known only through servants and legal documents. One heir, William DuPont Jr., lived a life of such profound isolation on his enormous estate that he became a local mystery. A man who owned thousands of acres yet inhabited only a few rooms. The pressure to uphold the DuPont name, to manage a colossal fortune, and the expectations that came with it, exacted a terrible psychological toll. Their public face was one of unshakable confidence and aristocratic poise, but in private, many were crumbling under the weight of their inheritance. The darkest secret of the DuPont dynasty was not the gunpowder or the feuds, but the quiet, desperate loneliness that their immense wealth and prestige could not cure, and often actively created. High on a California hilltop, a castle dreamed into existence by William Randolph Hearst stands as a monument to one man's absolute power. Saint-Simon was his personal kingdom, a sprawling complex of imported European antiques, private zoos, and vast libraries, built not just to house his art, but to contain the people within it. The most famous resident, besides Hearst himself, was the Hollywood starlet Marion Davies. Their decades-long affair was the worst-kept secret in America, a gilded captivity orchestrated by one of the world's most powerful men. Hearst did not simply love Marion, he owned her. He controlled her career, isolating her from friends and colleagues, and used his colossal media empire to craft a narrative of their lives that suited only him. This was psychological manipulation on an industrial scale. If a politician, a business rival, or even a potential suitor for Marion dared to cross him, Hearst could unleash his newspapers to destroy their reputation with fabricated stories and vicious personal attacks. He built a world where his word was law, and Marion was his most cherished and most trapped subject. She lived in unimaginable luxury, yet she was a prisoner in a palace. Her life a constant performance for the man who held the keys. The tragedy did not end with them. The corrosive nature of such immense power and control seeped into the next generation, erupting in a shocking public drama. Their granddaughter, Patty Hearst, was infamously kidnapped by a radical political group in the 1970s. The event itself was terrifying, but what followed was a media circus that ripped the family's private tensions wide open. The world watched, mesmerized, as Patty appeared to sympathize with her captors, even participating in a bank robbery. The Hearst family was torn between a public campaign for her release and a private struggle to understand her transformation. The kidnapping was a sensational crime, but it was also a stark unveiling of a family buckling under the weight of its own notoriety and fortune. It revealed a dynasty that, for all its castles and control, was just as vulnerable to chaos and heartbreak as any other. What does it say when the very power used to build a private universe cannot protect the people living inside it from unraveling? Even the most stoic of dynasties could not build a wall high enough to keep their private sorrows from spilling into public view. The Mellon family presented an image of quiet, unshakable dignity, pillars of American banking and industry who seemed to operate above the fray. But their true power was not in the money they counted, but in the laws they helped write from the shadows. While the Vanderbilts spent and the Astors socialized, the Mellons governed. Their fortune, built on banking, aluminum, and oil, was not merely invested in the economy. It was used to manipulate the very rules of the game. Andrew Mellon, as Secretary of the Treasury under 3 presidents, did not just oversee the nation's finances. He shaped them to directly benefit his own vast industrial empire. He pushed for massive tax cuts for the wealthiest Americans and corporations, policies that dramatically increased his personal fortune while doing little to stem the rising tide of the Great Depression. This was not public service. It was a breathtaking conflict of interest, a fusion of personal and national treasury that enriched his family at the expense of the country he was sworn to serve. The most blatant example of this shadow governance was the Teapot Dome scandal. While the public outrage focused on the bribery within President Harding's cabinet, the Mellon-controlled banks were the silent financiers, providing the loans that made the entire corrupt scheme possible. They were the house that always won, funding all sides and ensuring their influence remained untouched no matter which politicians fell from grace. When Franklin D. Roosevelt's New Deal promised a new vision for America, one of regulation and social safety nets. Andrew Mellon became its most virulent and powerful opponent. He saw the government's efforts to help the common man as a direct assault on the absolute power of industrialists like himself. He used his fortune and his political connections to fund legal challenges and smear campaigns, fighting to preserve a system where men like him could operate with zero accountability. The Mellon family's darkest secret was this: that their public facade of dignified bankers concealed a relentless, behind-the-scenes machine dedicated to controlling American democracy itself for their own perpetual profit. Yet for all their political cunning, they were utterly powerless against the personal tragedies unfolding within their own homes. The marriage of Andrew's son, Paul Mellon, to his first wife, Mary Conover, was a perfect example of the Gilded Cage. On the surface, they were the ideal couple, blessed with unimaginable wealth, intelligence, and social standing. But Mary suffered from severe asthma and debilitating depression, conditions the family viewed not as illnesses to be treated with compassion, but as embarrassments to be hidden. They maintained a strict, suffocating facade of stoic dignity, refusing to publicly acknowledge her struggles. The immense pressure of this perfect performance, of having to play the happy heiress while battling inner demons, became too much for her to bear. Mary Conover Mellon died from a combination of asthma and a barbiturate overdose at the age of just 42. A tragedy that many close to the family believed was a suicide, the ultimate cost of a life lived under the weight of a name that valued image above all else, even human life. Her death forces a haunting question: what is the true value of a fortune that can bend a nation to its will, yet cannot heal the suffering of the very people it was meant to protect? Andrew Carnegie preached a gospel of wealth, but his own fortune was forged in the fires of a bitter labor war. He rose from a penniless Scottish immigrant to the undisputed king of American steel, a self-made man who famously argued that the rich had a moral duty to give away their money for the public good. This was his gospel of wealth, a philosophy that promised the wealthy were merely trustees for society, obligated to use their riches to benefit all. Yet this noble ideal collided with a brutal reality in the summer of 1892 at his Homestead Steel Works near Pittsburgh. Carnegie and his hardline partner, Henry Clay Frick, were determined to break the union that protected the workers' wages and dignity. When the workers refused to accept drastic pay cuts and the dissolution of their union, the company locked them out, surrounding the massive plant with a 3-mile-long fence topped with barbed wire. It was not a negotiation. It was a declaration of war. Carnegie, who often voiced sympathy for workers, conveniently retreated to his Scottish estate, leaving the notoriously anti-union Frick in charge. Frick's solution was to hire 300 armed Pinkerton agents, private mercenaries, to take back the mill by force. In the pre-dawn darkness of July 6th, the Pinkertons arrived on barges along the Monongahela River. They were met by thousands of determined steelworkers and their families, who had been waiting for this very moment. What began as a standoff exploded into a bloody 12-hour gun battle. The workers rained down bullets and even homemade explosives on the barges. The Pinkertons returned fire. When the smoke cleared, at least a dozen men were dead, and dozens more were wounded, their blood staining the riverbank. The state militia was eventually called in to crush the strike and reopen the mill with non-union labor. The workers' defeat was total, and the union was destroyed for the next 4 decades. The Homestead strike was not just a labor dispute. It was a massacre, and its violence left a permanent stain on Carnegie's carefully crafted image as a benevolent industrialist. The contradiction was staggering. Here was a man who would later fund thousands of public libraries, believing knowledge was the path to uplift for the common man, yet he presided over a system that actively crushed the very men who needed that uplift the most. His workers labored in hellish conditions for 12 hours a day, 7 days a week, facing constant danger from molten steel and machinery for poverty wages, while he amassed a fortune that would make him one of the richest men in history. This is the core of the Carnegie dilemma, the profound hypocrisy that haunted him for the rest of his life. Privately, he expressed deep regret and guilt over the bloodshed at Homestead. He was said to be genuinely tormented by the event, a shadow that followed him even as he dedicated his later years to monumental philanthropy, giving away over $350 million. He built libraries, concert halls, and institutes for peace. But many critics saw this not as pure charity, but as a frantic, lifelong campaign of atonement. He was trying to wash the blood off his money with a river of good deeds. This forces us to confront an uncomfortable question. Can a fortune built on the broken backs of workers ever be truly cleansed by charity? Does building a library for a community justify the violence used to extract the wealth that built it? Andrew Carnegie's legacy is a monument to this very conflict, a towering paradox of American ambition where the pursuit of immense good was forever shadowed by its terrible, unforgotten cost. While Carnegie wrestled with his public conscience, another titan operated with no such visible conflict. J.P. Morgan did not build factories or break strikes. He built empires of debt and credit, becoming the most powerful unelected man in American history. His influence was so absolute that during the Panic of 1907, when a cascade of bank failures threatened to plunge the entire nation into economic collapse, it was not the government that intervened. It was J.P. Morgan. He single-handedly orchestrated the rescue, summoning the country's most powerful financiers to his private library and locking the doors until they agreed to a multi-million-dollar bailout package. He was, in effect, America's unofficial central banker, a position he wielded with a chilling mix of public responsibility and ruthless self-interest. This was the dark secret at the heart of his heroism. While he publicly appeared to save the day, he was also strategically consolidating his own power and that of his inner circle. In the aftermath of the panic, Morgan and his allies acquired failing trusts and banks at a fraction of their value, swallowing his weakened competitors and tightening his grip on the nation's financial arteries. The rescue was real, but so was the calculated exploitation that followed, a masterful play that strengthened his monopoly under the guise of national service. The true nature of his power lay in these secretive consortiums, private groups of bankers who decided the economic fate of millions behind closed doors. They controlled the flow of capital, determined which industries would thrive and which would starve, and manipulated markets with a wave of their collective hand. There was no transparency, no public oversight, only the absolute authority of men like Morgan who answered to no one but themselves. This was financial warfare disguised as prudent management, a cutthroat game where the winners took everything and the public bore the risk. Yet the Morgan family cultivated a public image of patrician responsibility and cultured sophistication. J.P. Morgan Sr. was a voracious collector of art and rare books, a pillar of the Episcopal Church, a man who presented himself as a steady hand on the economic tiller. He understood that the appearance of stability and old-world dignity was essential to maintaining public trust in his vast, shadowy operations. This carefully constructed facade allowed him to engage in the most aggressive financial maneuvers while being perceived not as a predator, but as a prudent statesman. The darkest secret of the Morgan dynasty was this deliberate duality, the ability to project an image of benevolent authority while orchestrating financial schemes that centralized immense power and wealth in the hands of a very few, proving that the most dangerous control is not always seized by force, but quietly acquired in a paneled library with a handshake and a calculated smile. Even the most glittering social alliances could conceal a devastating private reality. The marriage of Gertrude Vanderbilt and Harry Payne Whitney was a union of two of America's most formidable fortunes, a merger of railroad money and tobacco wealth that was celebrated across the front pages. They were the golden couple, presiding over a world of polo matches, yachts, and grand balls, the very picture of Gilded Age success. But behind the closed doors of their Fifth Avenue mansion, a very different story was unfolding. Harry Payne Whitney was living a brazen double life, conducting a series of very public extramarital affairs that were an open secret in their social circle. He did not even attempt to hide his infidelity, flaunting his mistresses at the same parties his wife was expected to attend. The most profound betrayal, however, was his creation of a second, hidden family. He fathered a child with one of his mistresses, establishing a separate household and diverting a portion of his vast wealth to support this other life. This was the ultimate humiliation for Gertrude, a betrayal so complete it left her isolated in the very center of high society. The pressure to maintain a perfect public facade was immense. She was expected to smile graciously, host her parties with impeccable style, and publicly ignore the fact that her husband's shadow family was living just a few blocks away. Her personal anguish had to be buried beneath a mountain of social obligation, a silent scream in a world that valued appearances above all else. But Gertrude Vanderbilt Whitney refused to let her pain destroy her. Instead, she channeled that immense emotional turmoil into a force that would forever change the American cultural landscape. She began to collect art, not as a casual hobby, but with a fierce, focused passion. She sought out and supported living American artists at a time when the art establishment was still looking to Europe for validation. Her own sculpting studio became a sanctuary, a place where she could transform her private suffering into public expression. This was not merely a distraction, it was an act of survival. Her collection grew so vast that she eventually offered it as a gift to the Metropolitan Museum of Art, but they rejected it, deeming American art unworthy. So she did what a woman of her means and will could do. She built her own museum. In 1931, she founded the Whitney Museum of American Art, creating a permanent home for the artists she championed. The museum was more than a building, it was her legacy, a magnificent monument forged directly from the ashes of her personal devastation. It forces us to ask a profound question: what becomes of the pain we are forced to hide? For Gertrude Vanderbilt Whitney, the answer was a museum, a public testament to the private sorrow that her perfect society marriage demanded she never show. The same desire to control human destiny that built financial empires took a far more sinister turn with the Harriman family. While J. P. Morgan manipulated markets, railroad titan Edward H. Harriman sought to manipulate humanity itself. He was a man of ferocious energy and legendary arrogance, who took control of the struggling Union Pacific Railroad and rebuilt it into a modern marvel through sheer, unyielding force of will. His business tactics were notoriously cutthroat, even for the era, involving ruthless stock manipulations and fierce battles with rivals like James J. Hill. He believed utterly in his own superiority, a mindset that did not stop at the boardroom door. This profound belief in a natural hierarchy of men became the family's darkest and most dangerous inheritance. After his death, his vast fortune and his controversial philosophies passed to his wife, Mary Harriman. She channeled her grief and immense wealth into a cause she believed was profoundly moral, the American eugenics movement. She became one of its most significant and influential financial backers, funding the eugenics record office at Cold Spring Harbor, an institution dedicated to the so-called science of improving the human gene pool. This was not a fringe interest. It was a mainstream, respected pursuit among the elite, and the Harriman money helped give it a veneer of academic legitimacy. The movement's goals were terrifyingly simple: to encourage the reproduction of people deemed genetically superior, and to actively prevent the reproduction of those deemed inferior through policies like forced sterilization. The Harriman fortune, in essence, was used to fund a campaign that classified human beings as desirable and undesirable, a chilling ideology that sought to engineer society by deeming some lives unworthy of existence. This was the ultimate expression of old money arrogance, the belief that one's wealth and status granted not just social, but biological authority over others. How does a family recover from a legacy rooted in such a profoundly dark and dehumanizing vision? For the next generation, the answer was a deliberate and very public pivot. Averell Harriman, E.H.'s son, spent his entire life running away from the shadow of his father's controversial reputation and his mother's philanthropic choices. He became a dedicated public servant, serving as a diplomat, governor of New York, and a key architect of American Cold War policy. He was the acceptable, respectable face of immense wealth, a man who traded corporate ruthlessness for a lifetime of government duty. His sister, Mary Rumsey, also immersed herself in public life and progressive causes, championing New Deal initiatives. It was a comprehensive, generations-long effort at reputation laundering, an attempt to scrub the Harriman name clean of its association with eugenics by wrapping it in the flag of public service and liberal politics. Yet this very effort raises a difficult and lingering question. Can a lifetime of public service truly erase the fact that the family fortune was once used to promote an ideology of hatred and exclusion? The Harriman story leaves us with this uncomfortable paradox, where one generation's profound moral failure is met with the next generation's desperate attempt at atonement, a cycle that forces us to wonder if the sins of the parents can ever be fully buried, no matter how many diplomatic posts one holds or how many good deeds one performs. Henry Clay Frick built his fortune not on steel, but on coke, the fuel that feeds the blast furnaces, and he built it with a singular, chilling focus. While Carnegie preached a gospel of wealth, Frick practiced a gospel of absolute control. He was the hammer Carnegie used to break the Union at Homestead, the man who gave the order to bring in 300 Pinkerton agents to crush the steelworkers. When the resulting gun battle left a dozen men dead and the nation recoiling in horror, Frick did not express regret or retreat. He wired a message to Carnegie that was as cold as the steel they produced. The guards were being put back in the mills, he wrote, and our victory is now complete. For him, it was a simple business calculation, a problem efficiently solved with force. This earned him a notorious reputation as the most hated industrialist in America, a title that nearly cost him everything. Just days after the massacre, a young anarchist named Alexander Berkman, enraged by the violence against the workers, walked straight into Frick's Pittsburgh office. Berkman shot him twice at point-blank range and then stabbed him repeatedly in the leg. Miraculously, Henry Clay Frick survived. The physical wounds healed, but the psychological scars ran deep, cementing his worldview that the world outside his door was a violent, chaotic place filled with enemies. The opulent Fifth Avenue mansion he built, which today houses the Frick Collection, was his response to that trauma. It was not just a home, it was a fortress, a sanctuary of quiet beauty designed to be an impenetrable barrier against the strife he had helped create. Every inch of its Italianate facade, every serene courtyard, and every carefully placed masterpiece by Rembrandt, Vermeer, and Bellini was part of a grand, desperate contradiction. Here was a man who had orchestrated one of the most violent labor conflicts in American history, now surrounding himself with some of the most peaceful, transcendent art ever made. The Frick Collection is a monument to aesthetic perfection, but its foundation is laid with the bitterness of homestead. He filled his rooms with quiet Madonnas and gentle landscapes, as if trying to purchase the serenity his business practices had systematically destroyed. This creates an unsettling experience for any visitor who knows the history. You walk through rooms of breathtaking beauty, but you cannot escape the ghost of the man who built them, a man who sought refuge in art from the very violence he unleashed. What does it say about a soul that builds a palace of beauty to wall itself off from the consequences of its own actions? The Frick Collection stands as one of history's most elegant and troubling monuments, a beautiful lie constructed to hide a brutal truth. Jay Gould was so despised by the American public that newspapers openly celebrated his death. While other industrialists built railroads or factories, Gould built traps. His fortune was not forged in steel or oil, but in the abstract, smoke-filled rooms of Wall Street, where he perfected the art of financial sabotage. He would identify a vulnerable yet fundamentally sound railroad company. He would then quietly buy up its stock, gaining a measure of control. Once in charge, he would deliberately run the company into the ground, siphoning its assets and selling off its valuable parts for his own personal profit. He would issue fraudulent bonds and stocks, selling them to the public based on lies about the company's health and prospects. After he had bled the company dry and its stock price had collapsed, he would buy it back for pennies on the dollar, only to repeat the cycle all over again. This was not investing. It was a form of corporate cannibalism, and it left a trail of bankrupted companies and ruined investors in his wake. His most audacious scheme, however, targeted the very foundation of the American economy. In 1869, Jay Gould and his partner Jim Fisk concocted a brazen plan to corner the entire gold market. They understood that the price of gold was intrinsically linked to the value of the nation's currency and the health of its trade. If they could secretly buy up most of the available gold in New York, they could send its price skyrocketing, forcing anyone who needed to buy it, like farmers selling crops abroad or importers settling debts, to pay their exorbitant prices. To ensure their scheme would work, they needed inside information. They began lavishing gifts and attention on Abel Corbin, the brother-in-law of President Ulysses S. Grant. Their goal was to infiltrate the highest levels of government and influence its financial policy, specifically to prevent the Treasury from selling its own gold reserves, which would instantly crash the price. For weeks, the conspiracy worked. Good and Fisk bought and bought, driving the price of gold higher and higher. The panic erupted on September 24th, 1869, a day forever known as Black Friday. The trading floor of the gold exchange in New York descended into pure bedlam as the price soared to unimaginable levels. Men were screaming, shoving, and fainting in the chaos. Finally, the federal government intervened. President Grant, realizing the nation's financial system was seizing up, ordered the Treasury to release $4 million in gold onto the market. The price instantly collapsed. In moments, Good and Fisk were ruined, along with thousands of speculators, brokers, and businesses caught in the whirlwind. The fallout was catastrophic. While Good had secretly sold out just before the crash, leaving his own partner to face the music, the American public knew exactly who to blame. He was branded the most hated man in America, a title that would cling to his family like a shroud for generations. This was the unbearable inheritance his children received, not just a fortune of millions, but a name synonymous with treachery and greed. His sons and daughters grew up in the shadow of this profound public shame. Their response was a desperate, multi-generational campaign to rehabilitate the good name. They embarked on a strategic mission of philanthropy, donating vast sums to hospitals, universities, and museums. They pursued the ultimate social armor, marrying into some of the most established and respected families of the American aristocracy. They built palatial estates and collected old master paintings, surrounding themselves with the trappings of old money respectability in a frantic attempt to distance themselves from their father's grubby, new money notoriety. But the stain of Black Friday proved incredibly difficult to wash away. No matter how many ballrooms they built or charitable foundations they endowed, the question always lingered in the drawing rooms they so desperately wanted to join. Was this generosity a genuine change of heart, or merely the calculated price of buying a new reputation? The Good family's darkest secret was not a hidden crime, but a very public one, a legacy of shame so potent that it forced an entire dynasty to spend its fortune in a lifelong, and perhaps hopeless, quest for redemption. The tobacco fortune of James Buchanan Duke was built on a simple, universal craving. He did not just sell cigarettes. He engineered an addiction, perfecting the mass production and marketing that would hook generations of Americans. The American Tobacco Company became a monopoly that generated unimaginable wealth, but its foundation was the dependency of millions. This was the original sin of the Duke fortune, a dark secret hidden in plain sight within every pack of cigarettes sold. His only child, Doris, was born into this morally complicated empire, and she would inherit not only its billions, but also its profound curse of solitude. She was dubbed the richest girl in the world, a title that sounded like a fairy tale but functioned as a life sentence. From her earliest days, she was surrounded by a fortress of servants, lawyers, and financial advisors, all dedicated to preserving her wealth, yet utterly incapable of providing genuine human connection. Her childhood was one of immense privilege and profound emotional neglect, setting a pattern of isolation that would define her entire life. As an adult, Doris Duke's existence became a masterclass in paranoia and control. She retreated behind the walls of her multiple vast estates, from the Hawaiian shoreline to a New Jersey mansion she called Falcon's Lair. She installed elaborate security systems, lived behind bulletproof glass, and developed a deep, abiding distrust of nearly everyone who approached her, convinced they were only after her money. Her personal relationships were a series of secret tragedies. She married twice, both unions ending in divorce and acrimony. She had a single child, a daughter who died within 24 hours of birth, a loss that shattered her and deepened her retreat from the world. In her later years, she became obsessed with the concept of reincarnation, pouring millions into secret research, desperately hoping that a future life might offer the peace and simplicity this one had denied her. She even funded a lab to cryogenically freeze her body, a final, futile attempt to cheat the mortality that her wealth was powerless to prevent. When Doris Duke died in 1993, the carefully constructed walls around her life instantly crumbled, exposing the desolate reality within. The reading of her will ignited a firestorm of legal battles that dragged on for years. Her butler, a man named Bernard Lafferty, was named her executor and inherited a stunning $65 million, a bequest that immediately raised suspicions of undue influence. Distant relatives emerged to challenge the will, and a former yoga instructor claimed Doris had been manipulated in her final, frail years. The court proceedings became a public autopsy of a deeply lonely existence, revealing a woman so isolated that she was forced to bequeath her fortune to employees and strangers, having driven away or outlived everyone who might have loved her for herself. The bitter fight over her billions was the final, sad punchline to her story. It proved that the Duke fortune, for all its power to purchase anything in the world, could never buy its heir the one thing she truly needed: a single, trustworthy friend. What is the ultimate worth of a fortune that condemns you to a life of solitary confinement in a gilded palace? Even the most successful partners understood that some fortunes were best kept out of the public eye. While Carnegie wrestled with his legacy and Frick built his fortress, their associate Henry Phipps chose a different path, one of absolute and calculated invisibility. His share of the Carnegie Steel fortune was immense, but he dedicated his life not to spending it, but to hiding it. He believed that public attention was the greatest threat to his family's security and stability, and he engineered their entire existence around this principle of profound secrecy. His primary tool for this was the creation of secluded, private worlds. He purchased vast tracts of land, not to build palaces for show, but to build barriers against the world. His estate in Old Westbury, Long Island, was not just a home. It was a private kingdom, surrounded by high walls and dense, manicured woodlands designed to shield his family from any prying eyes. This was not mere privacy. It was a form of self-imposed exile, a life lived in a gilded bunker. The family practiced a level of discretion that became legendary in their circles. They avoided the society pages, shunned the glittering parties that consumed other Gilded Age families, and conducted their business and personal affairs with a silence so deep it was deafening. There were no scandals, no public feuds, no interviews. For the Phipps family, the ultimate luxury was not being seen at all. But what was the human cost of living in this self-made witness protection program? The internal family dynamics were shaped entirely by this mandate of secrecy. Heirs were not raised to be flamboyant spenders or public figures. They were groomed to be quiet, responsible stewards. Their purpose was to manage the fortune, to preserve the capital, and above all, to avoid attracting any attention. This pressure created lives of quiet obligation, where personal ambition or eccentricity was viewed as a dangerous liability. One did not pursue a passion for the arts or a career in politics. One studied finance and estate law. The expectation was a lifetime of diligent, anonymous management, a perpetual duty to a fortune whose origin story was one of brutal industrial warfare they wanted everyone to forget. The goal was to transform the raw, violent wealth of steel into something clean, quiet, and perpetually growing in the background. The Phipps family's darkest secret was not a single scandalous act, but the suffocating weight of this self-enforced silence. They achieved a level of privacy that every other dynasty envied. But at what price? Their legacy is one of immense, quiet success. Yet it forces us to wonder if a fortune that demands you erase yourself from the world is truly a fortune at all, or merely the most elegant prison ever built. The quiet, old money strategy of the Auchincloss family was never about flaunting wealth, but about weaving it into the very fabric of American power. Their name, whispered in the best clubs and on the most exclusive guest lists, represented a different kind of ambition, one achieved not through industry, but through meticulously arranged marriages. This was a long game of social engineering, where personal happiness was often the first sacrifice on the altar of family advancement. The most brilliant and tragic example of this was Janet Lee Bouvier. She was not born into the Auchincloss dynasty, but she married into it, becoming the second wife of Hugh D. Auchincloss, a standard oil heir. For Janet, this union was a strategic masterstroke, a leap from the fringes of high society into its innermost sanctum. But the price of that ticket was her own tumultuous first marriage to the charismatic but unreliable stockbroker, John Vernu Bouvier III. Her divorce and remarriage were calculated moves in a relentless social climb, and she imposed the same ruthless standards on her two daughters, Jacqueline and Lee. Their lives became a performance, a constant, exhausting effort to project an image of effortless grace and unshakable poise, no matter what private turmoil lay beneath the surface. The strain of maintaining this perfect facade created deep fissures within the family. Jacqueline, in particular, developed a complex and often distant relationship with her mother. Janet pushed her daughters to marry for status and security, priorities that clashed with their own romantic desires and intellectual pursuits. The family home was not always a place of warmth, but a training ground for a future role, a relentless preparation for a life in the spotlight. That spotlight became blindingly intense when Jacqueline Bouvier married John F. Kennedy. The Auchincloss family was suddenly at the center of the American political universe, their every move scrutinized by the world. They were now the unofficial royal family, and the pressure to maintain the immaculate Kennedy image was immense. Behind the scenes, however, they were also guarding their own private struggles. They had to navigate the very public infidelities of the president, the intense media obsession with Jackie, and the constant fear for their safety, all while presenting a united, dignified front to the world. The glamour of Camelot for the Auchincloss clan was a gilded cage of unimaginable pressure. They had achieved the ultimate social and political connection, but at the cost of living a lie on a global stage, forced to smile for the cameras while their world was filled with private anxiety and public deception. What is the true toll of a legacy built not on genuine connection, but on the cold, calculated leverage of human relationships? The true power of the Baker fortune was never measured in its public displays, but in the absolute silence that surrounded its influence. While other names filled the society pages, George F. Baker operated in the paneled backrooms where the nation's financial destiny was truly decided. As the stalwart ally of J.P. Morgan, he was not merely a banker. He was a pillar of the entire system, a man whose quiet nod could determine the flow of capital across the continent. But his most consequential act was so shrouded in secrecy that it would remain hidden for decades, a journey that began under the cover of night in November of 1910. Under assumed names and with a level of discretion befitting a spy novel, a small group of the country's most powerful financiers and a senator boarded a private railroad car. Their destination was the exclusive Jekyll Island Club off the coast of Georgia, a millionaire's retreat owned by people like Morgan and Rockefeller. Their official story was a duck hunting trip, but their real quarry was far more significant: the complete restructuring of the American banking system. For over a week, this clandestine group drafted the blueprint for what would eventually become the Federal Reserve Act. This was not a public debate held in the halls of Congress. It was a private meeting where a handful of unelected men designed the very institution that would control the nation's money supply, set its interest rates, and act as its lender of last resort. The dark secret of the Baker family and others involved was this profound conflict of interest. They were designing the rules for a game they themselves intended to play and dominate. The immense, unseen influence this gave them is almost impossible to overstate. They were creating a central bank that could protect their own vast holdings during financial panics, a system that would institutionalize their power rather than challenge it. The Federal Reserve, an entity meant to serve the public interest, was conceived in a private club by the very men who stood to benefit from it most. This is why the Baker family subsequently cultivated such a remarkably low profile. They understood that the controversy and public outrage that would follow if the true origins of the Fed were widely known could be catastrophic. They chose a life of quiet influence over one of flashy notoriety, building their estates behind high walls and funneling their wealth into discreet philanthropy and anonymous art collections. They became masters of the hidden hand, proving that the most powerful families are often the ones you never hear about at all. What does it mean for a democracy when its most fundamental economic structures are drafted in secret by the very individuals they are meant to regulate? While the Bakers manipulated finance in secret, the Burden family scandal detonated in the full, unforgiving glare of the public eye. Their fortune was anchored in the heavy industrial might of ironworks, a business that required immense capital and produced immense wealth. But in 1895, that solid foundation was shattered not by a financial crash, but by a single sensational divorce case. James A. Burden Jr., a scion of this iron dynasty, saw his private life become front-page news when his wife, Florence Adele Sloan, filed for divorce. She was not just any socialite. She was the daughter of one of the wealthiest men in America, making the case a collision of two gilded titans. The accusations Florence leveled in court were a bomb thrown directly at the heart of old money propriety. She did not speak in hints or whispers. She provided detailed, humiliating testimony of her husband's serial infidelity, naming specific women and describing extravagant gifts he had purchased for his mistresses with their shared fortune. She revealed a life of breathtaking excess, where money flowed like water to fund a secret, parallel existence of luxury for his lovers, all while she was expected to maintain the dignified facade of a burdened wife. James fought back with bitter accusations of his own, claiming Florence was an unfit mother and a neglectful spouse, but the damage was done. The trial became the most delicious gossip in New York, with every sordid detail devoured by a public fascinated by the spectacle of the elite tearing each other apart. For a family like the Burdens, whose name was their most valuable asset, this was a catastrophe. A public scandal was more dangerous than a bad investment. It was a social poison that could lead to ostracism from the very circles that gave their wealth its meaning. Exclusion from Mrs. Astor's 400, the loss of business partnerships founded on trust and reputation, the whispered slights at the opera. These were the real costs of a tarnished name. The family would have moved swiftly and ruthlessly to contain the fallout. Their first priority was to suppress the story, using their influence with newspaper owners to kill the most damaging articles. They would have deployed a small army of lawyers not just to fight the legal battle, but to manage the narrative, spinning a tale of a misunderstood husband or a hysterical wife. The ultimate goal was always to make the entire affair disappear from public memory as quickly as possible, to bury the truth beneath a mountain of silence and legal procedure. This frantic damage control reveals the ultimate fragility of their world. A fortune built over generations could be jeopardized not by a stock market crash, but by the revelation of a single, all too human failing. The Burden divorce forces us to ask, what is the true strength of a dynasty if its reputation is so brittle that one scandal can threaten to bring it all down? Even sweet fortunes have a bitter aftertaste. The Havermeyer name, now immortalized in the galleries of the Metropolitan Museum of Art, was built on a foundation of sugar and something far more sinister. Henry O. Havermeyer did not simply refine sugar. He sought to control its very market, creating the notorious Sugar Trust in the late 1800s. This was a monopoly that ruthlessly crushed its competitors, manipulating prices and strangling independent refiners until his company dominated the entire industry. The profits were staggering, but they were not enough. The same aggressive ambition that built his sugar empire led him into a far darker enterprise. His original firm, Havemeyer and Elder, was a major importer of crude opium. In the 19th century, opium was a legally traded commodity, used in a wide array of patent medicines and pain relievers sold in pharmacies and through mail order catalogs. There was nothing illegal about his trade, but the moral ambiguity was profound. He was profiting from a substance that, while medicinally accepted, was also known for its addictive and destructive properties, a substance that was already creating personal tragedies and social crises. The fortune that sweetened America's tea was, in part, built on the proceeds of a drug that was quietly poisoning it. This was the Havermeyer family's original sin, a secret buried not in ledgers, but in the very molasses that sweetened his sugar. The public face of this fortune, however, was one of impeccable taste and progressive values. Henry's wife, Louisine Havemeyer, became one of the most celebrated art collectors and suffragists of her era. She was a fierce campaigner for women's right to vote, a close friend of the radical feminist Emmeline Pankhurst, and a woman who used her social standing to champion a cause of profound moral urgency. With her husband's wealth, she assembled a breathtaking collection of paintings by masters like Degas, Manet, and Courbet, works that now form the heart of the Havermeyer collection at the Met. She presented an image of enlightened patronage, a sophisticated woman steering her family's fortune toward beauty and social progress. Yet this creates an almost unbearable contradiction. How does one reconcile the sublime beauty of a Degas ballerina, purchased with sugar and opium money, with the human cost of the monopoly and the addiction that funded it? Louisine's passionate fight for women's rights stands in stark contrast to the source of the money that empowered that very fight. Was her philanthropy and activism a genuine moral awakening, or was it, like so much in the Gilded Age, a sophisticated form of reputation laundering, an attempt to gild a fortune with a veneer of social conscience? The Havermeyer legacy forces us to confront the uncomfortable duality at the heart of so much cultural philanthropy. Can a museum wing filled with masterpieces ever truly cleanse the moral stain of the money that built it? But the most bitter fall from grace often belongs to those who remember their own greatness. The Livingston family name echoed through the earliest chapters of American history, from the signing of the Declaration of Independence to vast, feudal-style estates along the Hudson River. Theirs was not a new fortune, but an original American aristocracy, a dynasty that helped shape a nation. Their darkest secret, however, was not a single scandal, but a slow, agonizing fade into irrelevance, a generation's long sigh of decline. The immense land grants bestowed by British royalty, hundreds of thousands of acres that once constituted a personal kingdom, became the family's obsession and its curse. As the centuries turned, these claims were whittled away by new laws, disputed boundaries, and the simple, unstoppable progress of a modernizing nation. Later generations of Livingstons found themselves engaged in a series of desperate, often futile legal battles, trying to reclaim forests and fields that had long been settled by others. They were suing to possess a past that was already gone, their lawsuits reading like ghost stories from a bygone era. This reliance on past glory created a peculiar family culture of bitterness and deep, paralyzing nostalgia. Heirs grew up in houses filled with portraits of more important ancestors, surrounded by the crumbling evidence of their own diminished standing. They were taught to venerate a name that no longer opened the same doors or commanded the same fear and respect. The weight of that name became a burden, an heirloom more cumbersome than any piece of furniture. How do you build your own future when you are constantly measured against a legacy you can never hope to equal? For many Livingstons, the answer was a retreat into resentment. They became known for their haughty pride, a defensive arrogance that masked their growing financial anxieties and shrinking influence. They clung to the rituals of high society long after their means to properly fund them had evaporated, putting on airs while the roof of the family manor quietly leaked. The world had moved on, but the Livingstons remained trapped in the amber of their own history, forever living in the long, cold shadow of a power they had already lost. For the Cushing sisters, marriage was not a matter of the heart, but a calculated strategy for dynastic advancement. Their mother, Catherine, engineered the social trajectories of her three daughters with the precision of a general, aiming not just for wealth, but for the highest echelons of American power. Babe, Betsy, and Minnie were groomed to be the ultimate weapons in this quiet war. Their beauty and charm polished into keys that would unlock the doors to the most exclusive circles in the world. Each sister achieved what was considered a spectacular triumph. Betsy married the financier James Roosevelt, becoming the stepmother of a future president. Minnie wed the wealthy socialite William S. Paley, and the most famous of them all, Babe, became the wife of the notoriously difficult Standard Oil heir, William Paley. From the outside, they had won the ultimate prize, a permanent place in the sun. But the glittering reality of their lives was a carefully maintained performance, one that demanded a terrible, hidden cost. The pressure to be the perfect society wife was relentless. They were expected to be flawless hostesses, impeccably dressed, eternally serene, and endlessly fascinating. To maintain the wafer-thin figures required by high fashion and to sustain the exhausting social whirl, many in their circle, including Babe, secretly relied on amphetamines. These diet pills and uppers were the open secret of the jet set, a chemical crutch that provided the energy to maintain the illusion of effortless perfection while masking profound emotional exhaustion. Their husbands, the powerful men they had married, were often absent, emotionally distant, or publicly unfaithful. William Paley's chronic infidelity was a deep, humiliating wound for Babe, a betrayal she was forced to endure with a public smile to preserve the facade of a perfect union. The sisters lived in a world of unimaginable material luxury, yet they were trapped in emotional voids, their lives defined by a loneliness that no amount of adoration from the society pages could ever fill. They had been trained to acquire a title or a fortune, but they were never taught how to acquire happiness. The Cushing sisters' darkest secret was not a single scandalous affair, but the systemic, soul-crushing sacrifice of their inner selves on the altar of social success. Their story forces a haunting question. What is the true value of a brilliant match if the woman who made it is slowly erased in the process? The legal architecture of these fortunes was as formidable as any mansion. To prevent the kind of reckless spending that plagued the Vanderbilts, dynasties turned to complex, ironclad legal structures known as trusts and entails. These were not merely financial plans. They were cages of capital, meticulously designed to control the behavior of future generations from beyond the grave. A patriarch could dictate precisely how his money was to be used, often for 100 years or more, tying up the fortune in a web of restrictions that made it impossible for any single heir to squander it. The stated goal was preservation, the eternal safeguarding of the family name, but the dark, human consequence was a profound loss of autonomy. An heir could be the legal owner of $100 million, yet have no power to access the principal, forced to live on a strict allowance determined by a long-dead ancestor and enforced by unsympathetic trustees. Their career choices, their marriages, even their place of residence could be influenced by the trust stipulations, all in the name of protecting an asset they could see but never truly touch. This legal stranglehold inevitably sparked some of the most bitter and public family wars ever recorded. Heirs repeatedly sued their own parents, siblings, and cousins to break these trusts, desperate to gain control over their own lives and destinies. These were not simple greed, but profound battles for personal freedom. Consider the case of the reclusive Huguette Clark, a copper heiress who lived the last decades of her life in hospital rooms while her vast fortune sat frozen in trusts. After her death, distant relatives emerged to challenge her will, alleging she was manipulated in her isolation, a tragic figure whose life and death were dictated by the very legal instruments meant to protect her. These courtroom dramas expose the raw human truth beneath the polished surface of dynastic planning. They revealed the simmering resentment of an heir who wanted to be an artist, but was forced into finance, or the fury of a descendant who watched their inheritance be managed by distant lawyers while they struggled to pay their bills. The trust, created to prevent family conflict, often became its primary source. What does it ultimately profit a family to preserve its wealth if the cost is the happiness and freedom of the people who carry its name? This is the ultimate paradox of old money, a world where the dead hand of the past forever grips the wrist of the living. The grandest fortunes have indeed cast the longest shadows, each one filled with secrets of ruthless ambition, hidden sorrow, and the immense, crushing pressure to uphold a perfect facade. From the Vanderbilts' gilded loneliness to the Rockefellers' moral reckoning, from the Rothschilds' poisoned reputation to the Hearst family's controlled captivity, these stories share a common, haunting truth. Wealth and status are no shield against human frailty. In fact, they often amplify it, creating gilded cages where personal happiness is the first sacrifice demanded for the preservation of a name. The relentless pursuit of a flawless public image left heirs isolated, paranoid, and trapped in lives of quiet desperation, proving that the most dangerous inheritance is not the fortune itself, but the secrets required to keep it. These legacies, now immortalized in museums and history books, were often built on foundations of profound moral compromise. The darkest secret of all is that the very thing these families fought so hard to build, their eternal legacy, is forever stained by the difficult, and sometimes terrible, choices made to achieve it. We have looked into the lives of the rich and powerful and found that their greatest struggles were not for more money, but for the simple human comforts of trust, love, and peace of mind, things their wealth could never truly buy. Let us know in the comments which old money secret shocked you the most. And do not forget to subscribe for more deep dives into the hidden histories of power and privilege.